The night in Norfolk was unusually quiet. Fog rolled off the harbor, curling around the warehouses like a living thing. Streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across cracked pavement. Ray's boots echoed as he slipped down the narrow alley behind the docks, heart pounding, not with fear but with anticipation. This was supposed to be an easy score. A woman, alone, walking past a quiet stretch of warehouses, no witnesses, no alarms. A paycheck he didn't have to work hard for. He had rehearsed the scenario dozens of times in his head. Tonight, it was real. Ray's eyes narrowed as he saw her. She was walking briskly, hands tucked in the pockets of her leather jacket, her dark hair hidden beneath the hood. There was nothing extraordinary about her at first glance, and yet something made him pause. She wasn't careless. Her pace was deliberate, controlled. She scanned the streetlights, the empty alleyways, every corner as though expecting someone or something. Most women didn't do that. Most women didn't notice the kind of danger he carried. He ducked behind a dumpster and checked his gun, a small, unremarkable pistol that had ended more than one petty fight in his favor. He had done this before, dozens of times. But tonight, as he crept forward, every instinct whispered that something was different. The air seemed heavier, charged. He swallowed hard and tightened his grip. She was close now, within 20 feet. Perfect. Ray stepped out from the shadows, gun raised. "Hey," he barked. His voice cracked slightly, betraying more excitement than threat. The woman froze. Slowly, she turned toward him, her hood falling back to reveal her face in the dim light. And that's when Ray's world tilted. Her eyes met his and he stumbled slightly back. They were calm, too calm, calculated. A predator's calm, the kind that made seasoned criminals like him pause mid-step. Her gaze was unflinching, almost knowing. She didn't flinch, didn't scream, didn't bolt. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, and a small, dry smile touched her lips. "You shouldn't have come this way," she said, her voice low, controlled. "Do you know who I am?" Ray's confidence wavered. Just give me your wallet," and he faltered, realizing he didn't even know why he was speaking. Something about her unsettled him. He had faced men bigger, stronger, more dangerous. But her presence, it pressed against him like a physical weight, making his limbs sluggish, his thoughts scattered. Then she spoke again, calm, deliberate, with an almost surgical precision. "Ray, I know your full name. I know where you live. I know about the debt you skipped last month. I know who your brother works with. And I know what you did last Friday night." Ray froze. His hand twitched on the gun, but he couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. How do you know that?" he stammered. Panic crept in, sharp and icy. "I've been watching," she said simply, stepping closer. There was no menace, no threat in her voice, only an unyielding, unshakable certainty. And then, almost casually, she tilted her head and fixed him with a gaze that seemed to penetrate straight through to his soul. "Do you understand what happens to people who try to corner me?" Ray's mind raced. Stories. He remembered the stories. The whispers in bars, the half-drunk conversations between dock workers and ex-Marines, the fearful murmurs in dark corners. Ghost, Hale, Navy SEAL, legendary operative, vanished years ago after a mission gone wrong. Impossible to catch, impossible to hurt. And now she stood in front of him, alive, calm, and impossible. Ray swallowed, voice trembling. Your ghost." Her smile deepened slightly. "The one and only," she said. "And tonight you made the biggest mistake of your life." Suddenly, Ray realized he had walked straight into a trap he couldn't comprehend. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Every crime he had committed, every corner he had cut, every moment he had been lucky, it meant nothing now. He was a small fish in a sea he couldn't even begin to understand. She moved then, but not aggressively. Just a subtle shift, a small step forward, enough to unbalance him psychologically. Ray's mind screamed at him to act, to pull the trigger, to run. But instinct screamed louder, "Don't move, don't breathe, don't blink." Her hand rose slightly, almost lazily, but there was a coiled power in the movement that reminded Ray of a panther ready to strike. He realized she wasn't just trained, she was perfect at it. Years of discipline, of impossible missions, of life-or-death decisions, all embedded in every movement, every gaze, every pause. Ray's gun felt heavier. His confidence was gone. Fear rooted him to the spot. Ghost's presence was a paradox, calm, almost bored, yet carrying a lethal intensity that made every second stretch into eternity. He realized almost too late that he had nothing on her. Not his gun, not his street smarts, not his bravado. Nothing. Then she spoke again, almost conversationally. "I can end this right now. In a second you could be unconscious or worse, but I'm giving you a choice. Walk away. Leave this alley, forget this happened. Or stay and test the consequences of your recklessness." Ray's mouth opened, then closed. His mind scrambled. He knew running was futile. He could feel it in her aura, her gaze, the way she seemed to bend the air around her. Every story he had ever heard about Ghost, the impossible rescues, the missions no one survived, the men who disappeared trying to follow her trail, flashed before his eyes. He slowly lowered his gun, hands shaking. I don't want trouble," he said, voice barely audible. I can leave." Ghost studied him for a moment, her eyes never leaving his, then nodded ever so slightly. "Good choice," she said. "Most people don't make it that easy. Remember this night. Remember me." Ray stumbled backward, barely comprehending what had just happened. She turned and disappeared into the fog, moving with a fluid grace that left no trace. And as he watched her vanish into the shadows, Ray knew one thing with chilling clarity. He had looked into the eyes of a legend, a living ghost, and survived. For the first time in his life, fear wasn't adrenaline, it was respect. And the kind of respect that could save a man's life or end it. Ray stumbled backward into the fog, his breath ragged, heart pounding like a war drum. The echo of her voice still lingered in his ears. "Most people don't make it that easy. Remember me." He pressed his palms to his face, trying to process what had just happened. Ghost Hale wasn't just a name whispered in fear by petty criminals and ex-military alike. She was a legend, a living, breathing, unstoppable force, and Ray had just stared down the barrel of her lethal composure. The alley had emptied in seconds, but the weight of her presence didn't leave. Every story Ray had ever heard about Ghost now collided in his mind. The impossible missions, the vanished targets, the men who disappeared after crossing paths with her. For years, rumors had circulated among the underground networks, a mixture of awe and fear. "If you ever see her, don't move, don't speak. Just pray she lets you walk away." Ray had laughed at the stories once. Now he understood they were all true. He slumped against the wall of a nearby warehouse, trying to catch his breath. His hand still shook where the gun had been. The realization gnawed at him. This wasn't a robbery anymore. He hadn't cornered a weak target. He had provoked a predator. And predators like Hale didn't forgive mistakes, they erased them. Every instinct he had honed for years on the streets told him to run, hide, vanish. Yet a deeper, more primal fear told him that running wouldn't save him. Ghost didn't chase. She eliminated. Ray's thoughts drifted to his brother, Michael, a former Marine stationed overseas. Ghost's calm familiarity with his name and his life implied knowledge no civilian could possibly have. Michael had always been cautious, careful about whom he associated with. Was it possible she knew Michael personally? Ray shivered. Every street corner, every dark alley in Norfolk suddenly seemed like a potential trap. He had stumbled into a story far larger than petty crime and far deadlier. The stories of Ghost came rushing back in vivid detail. A Navy SEAL, recruited young for her exceptional talent, trained in stealth, infiltration, and extraction. Every mission she completed was whispered about, almost mythic. She could bypass heavily guarded facilities, neutralize threats without a trace, and vanish into thin air. Soldiers who had trained alongside her described her as unreal, as if she existed on a different plane. And yet, Ghost had disappeared completely after a controversial mission overseas. Official records claimed she had retired, but no one truly knew what had become of her. Ray shivered, realizing the full gravity of what had just occurred. She hadn't just disarmed him physically, she had disarmed him mentally. That calm, piercing gaze had stripped away his bravado, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, terrified. And more than that, he had seen respect in her eyes, a rare acknowledgement of choice. He had survived by a fraction of a second, by a chance she had allowed him to exist. The street rules he had lived by all his life suddenly seemed trivial, meaningless in comparison to the reality of someone like her. The fog thickened, curling around the rusted crates and abandoned shipping containers. Ray's mind raced, trying to reconcile legend with reality. If Hale Ghost was truly alive and operational, then her disappearance had never been voluntary. She had vanished for a reason he could only guess at, but instinct told him it was far darker than petty crime or government bureaucracy. The fact that she had spared him, intentionally, deliberately, meant he was now part of a world he had never understood and could not escape from. Ray tried to piece together her motives. Why had she stopped him instead of ending him? Was it mercy, strategy, curiosity, or something connected to his brother Michael? The memories of their childhood ran through his mind. Michael saving him from fights he couldn't win, teaching him discipline he rarely applied, warning him about the wrong kind of people. Was Ghost now repaying a debt? Or was she testing him, seeing whether he could survive, adapt, and, just possibly, be useful? He stumbled to a bench near the alley's edge and sank down. The adrenaline still pulsed through him like fire. His life, as he had known it, had shifted in an instant. He had been a small-time criminal, a man used to taking risks and exploiting weakness. Tonight he had confronted strength he could not fathom and survived. The city around him felt different now, dangerous in a way he hadn't understood before. Every dark corner could hide Ghost, or worse. Ray's phone vibrated in his pocket. His fingers fumbled as he pulled it out, expecting a routine message or a call from an associate. Instead, it was a single text. "You don't know what you've stumbled into. Don't move. Don't call anyone. Wait." There was no sender. His stomach knotted. She was still watching him. She always was. The stories were true. Ghost didn't just vanish. She existed in the shadows, omnipresent, aware, untouchable. Fear gave way to a strange, reluctant respect. He realized that if he survived this night, he would never look at the world the same way again. He had glimpsed a life beyond petty crime, beyond streets and alleyways. A world where choices were measured in seconds, where consequences were absolute, and where one woman could hold the power to decide life and death with mere presence. Ghost had existed in that world, had mastered it, and he had seen it firsthand. Ray remembered the way she moved, so controlled, so precise, so utterly calm in the face of danger. He realized she wasn't just trained, she was perfected. Every step, every glance, every subtle shift in posture carried a lethal purpose. He had faced armed men before, experienced knife fights, carjackings, robberies gone wrong. None of it had prepared him for the quiet power of Ghost. He had underestimated legend itself, and he would never make that mistake again. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, Ray couldn't tell. The fog swallowed the alley, the docks, the distant hum of the harbor. Every sound seemed amplified. A seagull's cry, the distant rumble of a cargo ship, the drip of water from a leaking pipe. He felt watched, observed, vulnerable. He knew she could return at any moment, or perhaps she had already vanished, leaving only the memory of her presence. And yet in that absence he felt the weight of obligation, of understanding. He had survived, but he had also been warned. Ray's thoughts turned again to Michael. If Ghost had known him, had recognized the family connection, then his brother's life was intertwined with this legend in ways he couldn't comprehend. Protective instincts surged, mixed with fear. What had his brother done to merit such attention? And what had Ray done to stumble so recklessly into her path? Questions swirled, unanswerable, as the fog continued to roll across the docks, thick and suffocating. Finally, Ray stood, shaking, exhausted, and began walking away from the alley. Each step felt surreal, weighted with the memory of those piercing eyes and the voice that had named him so precisely. He knew the night was far from over. Ghost had not disappeared completely. He could feel it in the air, in the silence, in the way the shadows seemed to move. She was everywhere and nowhere, and he had glimpsed a truth most men only feared in whispers. Tonight, Norfolk had changed. Ray had changed, and the world would never be the same again, not for him. Ghost Hale moved through the night with silent precision, blending into the fog-shrouded streets as if she were part of the shadows themselves. Every movement, every step, carried the weight of years spent in training that pushed the human body and mind beyond ordinary limits. She had disappeared from the public eye years ago, but the world of covert operations never truly forgets someone like her. Ray had only glimpsed the surface of her legend, the edges of a story that ran deeper, darker, and more dangerous than he could imagine. Ghost's history was one written in secrecy and sacrifice. From the moment she was recruited into the Navy SEALs, she excelled beyond expectations. Unlike many of her peers, she thrived under pressure, demonstrating a rare combination of intelligence, physical skill, and an instinct for survival that bordered on preternatural. She moved with purpose in every exercise, infiltrating simulated enemy bases, executing mock extractions, and neutralizing targets in ways her instructors described as unreal. By the time she graduated from training, she was not just a soldier, she was a weapon, honed to perfection. Her assignments had been classified from the start, missions that few, even within the military hierarchy, knew about. Ghost became known as the operative who could enter a hostile compound undetected, extract high-value targets, and vanish without leaving a trace. She had saved lives in operations that had gone sideways, turning missions that were supposed to be fatal into triumphs. Her superiors called her invaluable, her peers called her impossible. And yet, despite the accolades, Ghost carried a burden few could understand. Every life she took, every mission she completed, left scars that the world would never see. The turning point in her career came during a mission overseas that would ultimately define her legend and seal her fate in the eyes of the military. Intelligence had suggested a high-value target was hiding in a civilian compound. Ghost led the operation with her usual precision, neutralizing threats as trained. But when the smoke cleared, she realized the intelligence had been flawed. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Children, families, innocents. It was a mistake no operative could easily forgive. A mission that should have ended with precision and discipline, but instead had consequences she could not bear. The fallout was immediate. She was lauded in reports for operational success but internally blamed herself for the lives lost. Orders came down that she was to continue missions, but Ghost made a choice that few could understand. She vanished. She left behind everything, rank, recognition, comradeship, and disappeared from the military entirely. No trace remained. Officially, she retired quietly, but in reality, she had chosen to operate in the shadows, taking on missions of her own design, guided by her own code of honor. It was during those years of disappearance that Ghost became the legend whispered about in fear and awe. Operatives in the field spoke of her as if she were a ghost in the literal sense, someone who could appear and disappear at will, always one step ahead. Criminal networks and paramilitary groups learned quickly that encountering her meant one thing: survival was uncertain. And yet, despite her lethal reputation, she was not a killer for pleasure. Every strike she took was calculated, every move deliberate, driven by a code of ethics that few could comprehend. Tonight, Ghost was not just a myth. She was a living, breathing operative whose awareness extended far beyond the ordinary. Race intrusion had forced her to confront a world she had hoped to avoid, but she handled it with the same precision she applied to every mission. Watching him stagger, realize the weight of his actions, she assessed his intentions, his fears, and his potential usefulness. Unlike the criminals she had encountered before, this one had a connection, a human link she could not ignore. His brother, a former Marine, had saved her life years ago during a covert operation. It was a debt she remembered, one she intended to repay in ways the world would never see. The streets of Norfolk, usually empty and desolate at this hour, now felt alive with invisible threats. Ghost sensed movement in the shadows, faint echoes of footsteps, a whisper of danger. Her instincts, honed over years of life-or-death situations, told her that exposure to someone like Ray was dangerous, not just for him, but for her. The criminal world was a web of surveillance, of men who kept records, who spoke in hushed tones about the impossible operative they called Ghost. Her presence had been noticed, and now the consequences of that awareness would ripple outward. Ghost's thoughts drifted briefly to Ray. He had been reckless, impulsive, the kind of man who could easily get himself killed. And yet in his fear she saw potential. Not as a soldier, not as a partner, but as a human being who could understand the weight of decisions he had never been prepared to face. In a way, his survival tonight was an anomaly, a testament to chance and to the discipline she carried in every step. She allowed him to live, to stagger away into the night, knowing that his path and hers would intersect again. Her mind shifted to the larger picture, the threats that had never left her since she disappeared. Private contractors, rogue operatives, and shadow networks had long sought her. One in particular, Atlas Strike, was persistent, ruthless, and well-connected. They had once tried to recruit her, then tried to eliminate her when she refused. Ghost had survived because she moved through the shadows, unpredictable, impossible to trace. And yet she knew that one mistake, or one reckless criminal like Ray stumbling into her path, could compromise everything she had built. Despite the danger, Ghost never faltered. She had trained for years to make split-second decisions, to weigh outcomes, and to act with precision. Ray's intrusion was a complication, but it was also an opportunity. He was connected to the world in ways that she could exploit. He could lead her to people she could trust, to resources she had long avoided. It was a risk, but one she was willing to take. As she vanished into the fog, Ghost's mind replayed the events of the night. The calm in her movements, the clarity of her focus, the awareness of every variable, these were not accidents. They were the culmination of years of training, of missions completed and lives saved, of choices made in impossible circumstances. Ray had seen a fragment of her world, a glimpse of the precision and discipline that defined her existence. Few ever did. Fewer still lived to tell the tale. Ghost paused atop a fire escape overlooking the alley where Ray had nearly crossed paths with death. She looked down at the empty street, letting the fog swallow her silhouette. Her mission was not yet over. The night was long, and threats were everywhere. But she moved with the certainty that had guided her for years, unafraid, unstoppable, legendary. And somewhere below, Ray walked unaware of how close he had come to a fate he could neither comprehend nor escape. Her story, as much as anyone knew it, was a warning. She was not just a soldier, she was a force. A ghost that haunted the underworld and military alike, a reminder that legends were not born. They were forged in moments like these, in decisions made under pressure, in choices that separated life from death. And for Ray, that lesson had just begun. Ray thought the worst of his night was over when he staggered away from the alley, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. But the city had other plans. Somewhere in the shadows, unseen eyes followed his every movement. Ghost, Hale, had disappeared into the fog, but her world of danger was far from over. Ray had stepped unknowingly into the path of forces that had long sought the elusive operative, and his presence had lit a beacon no predator could ignore. Atlas Strike was a name whispered in fear across clandestine networks. They were a private paramilitary organization composed of former elite soldiers, engineers, and intelligence operatives, each trained to eliminate threats with ruthless efficiency. Where governments faltered, Atlas thrived. They didn't answer to the law. They didn't answer to morality. Their purpose was power, influence, and the acquisition of secrets. And Hale, the ghost, was their obsession. She carried knowledge, skills, and information that made her both invaluable and dangerous to their agenda. The moment Ray had pressed his gun to her head, he had unknowingly sent a ripple through their system. Atlas had already been searching for her, tracking her movements for months. His presence, his recklessness, had exposed a thread that could lead them directly to her. And now they were closing in. They moved with the precision of hunters, silent and invisible, leaving no trace behind except the faintest signs for those trained to read them. Ray had stumbled into their world without knowing it, and the consequences were immediate. Ghost, aware of the danger, remained calm. She had survived worse, faced enemies more cunning and lethal than Atlas, and yet she did not underestimate the threat. Every step she took was calculated. Every alley, every rooftop, every shadow was analyzed for potential risk. Ray was a wild card, unpredictable and inexperienced, yet connected to someone she trusted, his brother Michael. That connection was fragile, tenuous, but it was a thread she could leverage to protect both of them. Ray, meanwhile, had no comprehension of the magnitude of what he had triggered. He thought he had narrowly escaped death, but in reality, he had only escaped a fraction of the danger surrounding him. The city, once familiar, now seemed like a maze of traps. Every corner might conceal a sniper, every alley a hidden operative. His criminal instincts, honed for petty street life, were no match for the precision and discipline of Ghost's world. The man who once prided himself on control now felt powerless, a pawn in a game whose rules he could not understand. As Ghost navigated the night, she considered the paths available. Atlas Strike would predict conventional movements, standard escape routes. They would anticipate rooftops, alleys, even the waterfront. To survive, she had to move in ways that expectation. She relied on improvisation, blending urban terrain with her training in ways that made her practically invisible. Her mind processed probabilities with the speed of a computer, evaluating threats, escape paths, and the potential reactions of those pursuing her. Ray followed cautiously, unsure whether to trust her instincts or his own, each step a balance between survival and curiosity. Ghost's silence was both a comfort and a warning. She didn't explain her plans. She didn't justify her decisions. Her world operated on logic and experience, not explanation. And yet, Ray sensed that he was being guided, protected by someone whose skill far exceeded his imagination. The danger escalated quickly. Atlas Strike's operatives were methodical, coordinating from shadows, communicating in codes Ray could not decipher. Each movement was deliberate, a faint reflection in a window, a shadow that lingered too long, a soft sound behind a chain-link fence. Ghost noticed these details instantly. She adjusted their route, moving Ray through abandoned warehouses, forgotten alleyways, and safe points she had long relied upon. She taught him, indirectly, how to move without being noticed, how to blend into the environment, how to think in ways he had never considered. Despite his fear, Ray began to understand the gravity of Ghost's world. She wasn't merely surviving. She was strategizing, planning 3 moves ahead, anticipating the intentions of enemies he couldn't see. Her calm contrasted sharply with his panic, and it forced him to adapt. Each step through the foggy streets of Norfolk became a lesson in survival, each decision a matter of life or death. The man who had once wielded a gun with careless confidence now understood what it meant to rely entirely on another human being's skill. Ghost occasionally glanced at him, assessing his reactions, noting the rapidity of his thought processes and the tremor in his hands. He was inexperienced, untrained, and dangerously naive. Yet she recognized a spark, a survival instinct, a stubbornness, a connection to someone who had saved her life in the past. That spark could be cultivated into something useful, something that might help them both survive the coming storm. Atlas Strike, meanwhile, tightened their net. Surveillance drones, human trackers, and intelligence operatives converged without hesitation. Their target was clear: Hale. Ray was collateral, an unpredictable variable to be eliminated or manipulated. The paramilitary organization moved with terrifying precision, cutting off avenues of escape, predicting behavior, and eliminating weaknesses. For Ghost, the risk was monumental, but she had faced impossible odds before. Her survival was not luck. It was the culmination of training, intuition, and experience that made her a ghost in every sense of the word. As the night stretched on, Ghost led Ray through a labyrinth of forgotten industrial sites. Rusted cranes, abandoned containers, and derelict warehouses became both cover and guidance. Ray struggled to keep up, his lungs burning, his mind racing. Ghost's movements were effortless, fluid, almost supernatural in their precision. She crossed streets with the assurance of someone who owned every shadow, every hidden path, every possibility. To the world, she was a myth. To Ray, she was the embodiment of fear and admiration combined. By the early hours of the morning, Ghost had assessed the full scope of the threat. Atlas Strike's operatives were closing in, and Ray's presence had already left a trail. She realized that they could not simply evade, they had to act. Strategy, misdirection, and calculated risk would be essential. Every move must count. And yet, despite the tension, Ghost remained composed. She had survived worse, and she would survive this as well. Ray, exhausted and terrified, finally found himself relying entirely on her instincts. Every decision, every step was guided by her unspoken commands. The realization hit him. This woman was more than a legend. She was a force of nature, a living weapon, and the only reason he remained alive. He had stumbled into her world, and now he had no choice but to trust it completely. The night ended not with a confrontation but with a calculated pause. Ghost found a place long abandoned, and ushered Ray inside. She ensured the entrance was concealed, the perimeter secure. The fog outside obscured the world, but inside, for the first time that night, Ray felt the faintest sense of safety. Not comfort, safety. Ghost sat silently, her eyes scanning the horizon through a cracked window. Ray realized that for her, vigilance was never optional. He could rest briefly, but she never could. Her life, her survival, demanded constant awareness, constant calculation, constant anticipation. And now he was part of that equation, whether he liked it or not. Tonight had changed everything. Ray had glimpsed a world far beyond petty crime, a realm where legends existed, where power and precision dictated life and death. Ghost had spared him, guided him, and now forced him into a world he could neither escape nor fully comprehend. And as the first hints of dawn crept over the Norfolk skyline, he understood one inescapable truth. His life, and everyone he cared about, would never be the same again. The fog over Norfolk had thickened, curling through the streets and warehouses like living smoke. Ray followed Hale, Ghost, through a maze of alleys, derelict buildings, and abandoned docks, his breath ragged, his mind a storm of fear and disbelief. Every step reminded him that he was no longer in control. Every shadow could conceal Atlas Strike, the private paramilitary organization that now hunted them relentlessly. For the first time in his life, Ray understood what it meant to be truly exposed, truly vulnerable, and utterly reliant on someone else's skill. Ghost moved with a fluid, silent precision, weaving through the night as if the city belonged to her. Ray tried to keep up, stumbling over debris, catching his breath, feeling the weight of the world closing in. She never glanced back, but Ray could sense her evaluation in every step. She was calculating, analyzing, always aware. He realized that he was more than just a witness to her skill. He was part of her mission now, an unpredictable variable she had no choice but to manage. They ducked into a derelict warehouse near the waterfront, the scent of rust and salt filling the air. Ghost moved to a window, scanning the streets outside with unerring focus. "They'll be here soon," she said softly, almost to herself. Her voice carried a calm authority that sent shivers down Ray's spine. He wanted to speak, to ask questions, but fear and exhaustion froze him. He had followed her because he had no choice, but he was beginning to understand that asking questions might be more dangerous than staying silent. As Ray caught his breath, Ghost turned toward him, her gaze sharp and penetrating. "You're connected to your brother," she said, her tone stating fact rather than asking. "Michael, he saved my life years ago during a mission overseas. You owe him nothing, but tonight you're collateral, and I won't let you die because of his past." Ray's mind reeled. His brother, the man he idolized for his discipline and courage, had unknowingly forged a connection to the most elusive and dangerous operative in modern history. And now Ray was living the consequences. Why are you helping me?" he whispered, barely audible. Ghost's eyes softened momentarily, a fleeting human touch in the hardened edges of a soldier. "Because some debts aren't forgotten," she said. "Because I survived and I remember." Then her focus returned to the streets outside, and the softness vanished. Survival always demanded priority over sentiment. Hours passed as they navigated Norfolk's abandoned industrial district, weaving through derelict streets, climbing fire escapes, and slipping along rooftops. Ghost's expertise was breathtaking. She moved with grace, foresight, and lethality built into every step. Ray's streetwise instincts were of no use here, but for the first time he began to adapt. He listened, observed, and tried to predict her movements, struggling to keep pace with someone who seemed more machine than human. The threat from Atlas' strike escalated. Ghost's trained instincts detected signs of surveillance, subtle reflections in broken windows, faint shadows at a distance, a soft shuffle behind a chain-link fence. Every signal demanded action. Ghost diverted their path through side streets and underground tunnels, places she had mapped years ago, long before Ray was even aware of the danger that now pursued them. He realized that she was leading him through a city he thought he knew like the back of his hand, yet it had become a labyrinth of life-and-death decisions. At one point, Ghost led them into an abandoned warehouse, barricading the entrance with rusted crates and debris. She scanned Ray carefully, noting his exhaustion and fear, but also the spark of adaptability in his eyes. "You can't survive this world on instinct alone," she said. "You need to see, think, anticipate." She handed him a small tactical device, something he didn't understand, explaining briefly that it could detect electronic signals, communications, and movement. "You'll need this," she said. "If Atlas finds us, you could save both our lives." Ray held the device awkwardly, realizing that he had stepped into a world where survival demanded more than courage. It demanded intelligence, awareness, and a willingness to trust someone utterly beyond comprehension. Ghost watched him silently, her eyes scanning every shadow, every crack, every potential threat outside their temporary sanctuary. The conversation shifted briefly, revealing glimpses of Ghost's humanity. She spoke of her missions, carefully omitting sensitive details but giving Ray enough to understand the stakes. She had risked everything to survive, not for fame or recognition, but to protect lives in ways the world would never acknowledge. "Legends," she said quietly, "exist because most people forget the cost of survival." Ray listened, captivated, understanding for the first time that this woman, mythic, lethal, and untouchable, was defined not just by skill but by honor. Despite the fleeting calm, danger never relented. Ghost detected movement in the distance, a team from Atlas strike closing in, using the shadows, the city's abandoned layout, and advanced surveillance to track them. She made the decision instantly: move again and move fast. They navigated through a network of rooftops and alleyways that Ray could barely comprehend, relying entirely on her guidance. Every step was measured, every pause was calculated. Ray began to sense a rhythm, a pattern, a method in what had seemed chaos. By the time dawn approached, Ray and Ghost had traversed half the city, avoided multiple detection points, and found a temporary she had prepared for emergencies like this. It was small, discreet, and fortified enough to withstand a direct confrontation if necessary. Ghost secured the perimeter while Ray tried to make sense of everything he had witnessed. He realized that the woman who had almost been a target for his petty crime was now his only shield against a force that could annihilate him without hesitation. Ghost finally allowed herself a moment of rest, sitting against a reinforced wall, scanning the cityscape through the broken window. "We're not safe yet," she said, almost to herself. "But we're alive, and that counts." Ray looked at her, awe mixing with fear. You're incredible," he whispered. How can someone be that?" "I survived," she interrupted, her voice firm. "That's all you need to know. Surviving isn't about skill alone. It's about knowing when to act, when to wait, and when to trust someone you've never met. You survived tonight because I chose to let you. Don't forget that." Ray nodded, the weight of her words pressing into him. For the first time, he felt the full responsibility of his survival. It was no longer about petty theft or luck. It was about navigating a world of lethal precision, making decisions that could determine life or death, and learning to trust a woman whose legend had already rewritten the rules of possibility. As the first light of morning broke over Norfolk, Ghost disappeared into the shadows outside their temporary refuge, leaving Ray to catch his breath and process the night. He realized that he was no longer an observer in this world. He was a participant, and every step forward would be fraught with danger, strategy, and impossible choices. Tonight had changed him. Tomorrow, it would test whether he could adapt, survive, and perhaps even play a role in the impossible world of Ghost Hale. And somewhere in the shadows, Atlas Strike tightened its grip, unaware that the prey they hunted might just lead them into a trap they could never predict. Ray had become part of a story far larger than himself, and the night had only just begun. The abandoned training grounds of Fields lay on the outskirts of Norfolk, shrouded in mist and the ghosts of past drills. Rusted targets swayed gently in the early morning breeze, and the skeletal remains of obstacle courses jutted into the fog. Ghost Hale moved with lethal precision, leading Ray through the labyrinth of concrete and metal. Every step, every glance was a calculated risk. Atlas Strike operatives were closing in, and she could feel the threads of their pursuit tightening around them like a predator stalking prey. Ray's breath came in ragged gasps. His muscles burned from the constant movement, from trying to keep up with a woman who seemed almost supernatural in her agility and awareness. Ghost paused for a moment, scanning the horizon. "Fields is risky," she said, her voice low but firm. "But it's also predictable. They think they can trap us here because they know the layout. That gives us an advantage if we use it correctly." Ray swallowed hard. "Use it how?" he asked, trying to keep up both physically and mentally. Ghost's eyes met his, piercing and sharp. "I'm going to show you," she said, "but you need to trust me completely. One wrong move and neither of us walks away." They advanced carefully, weaving between rusted training equipment and through long-abandoned shooting ranges. The silence was deceptive. Ghost had trained her senses to detect the slightest anomaly, the distant whisper of a boot, the faint reflection of a scope, the subtlest shift in wind patterns. Ray tried to follow her instructions, keeping low, listening intently, moving only when she signaled. He realized that survival wasn't about speed. It was about anticipation, awareness, and timing. The trap was set by Atlas Strike. They had knowledge of the facility and the terrain, relying on their paramilitary expertise to predict Ghost's movements. But they underestimated one thing: her ability to manipulate the environment to create misdirection and exploit assumptions. Ghost paused at a vantage point, observing the enemy's likely entry points and noting their blind spots. "They'll expect us to flee straight," she murmured. "We won't. We'll draw them into the kill zone on our terms." Ray felt a cold surge of fear. "Kill zone," he repeated, his voice catching. Ghost gave him a sharp look. "Stay focused," she said. "I won't let anything happen to you, but you have to move when I tell you. Your life depends on it." Hours passed in tense preparation. Ghost briefed him in rapid, clipped instructions. Use the terrain, stay hidden, listen, and trust her instincts. She showed him how to detect subtle signs of movement, to interpret shadows, and to anticipate enemy strategy. Every lesson was delivered in real time, a mix of observation and practice, turning Ray from a streetwise opportunist into a man barely capable of understanding the rules of survival in her world. As they settled into the predetermined positions, the distant hum of engines and the faint crunch of gravel alerted Ghost that Atlas Strike was approaching. She signaled Ray to stay low, crouched behind a rusted cargo container. His heart thundered in his chest. The operatives moved as expected, systematically sweeping the open areas, relying on numbers and firepower to compensate for what they could not anticipate. Ghost's lips pressed into a thin line, her mind calculating every variable, every probability. The first encounter came swiftly. An operative stepped into the open, scanning the warehouse. Ghost moved silently, almost imperceptibly, intercepting him before he could sound an alarm. A subtle twist of the wrist, a controlled takedown, and he was incapacitated, silent and unaware. Ray blinked, struggling to process the speed and efficiency of her movements. She was a phantom, a master of anticipation and precision. And yet, despite the danger, she remained calm, deliberate, and terrifyingly effective. Second wave approached. Ghost directed Ray to move, guiding him through hidden corridors and beneath scaffolding. Every step was choreographed, a deadly dance through shadows. Ray's instincts had never been tested this way. He stumbled, almost giving away their position. Ghost's eyes flicked to him sharply, but she did not chastise him. Instead, she adjusted his path, subtly reinforcing her lessons without breaking momentum. Survival depended on instinct, instruction, and the willingness to obey without question. Atlas Strike's operatives were skilled but predictable. Ghost exploited every assumption, every preconception they carried. She led Ray into positions where they could neutralize threats silently, one by one, without revealing their presence to the larger force. Each confrontation was a lesson, each victory a step toward survival. Ray began to understand, in fragments, the reality of the world Ghost had mastered, a world of anticipation, precision, and relentless focus where hesitation could be fatal. Hours dragged on. The fog thickened, the distant sunlight struggling to penetrate the mist. Ghost's voice remained calm but commanding, cutting through the tension. "Stay close, trust your instincts, follow my lead." Ray obeyed, each command a lifeline, each action a narrow escape from a force that would show no mercy. Atlas Strike's persistence was relentless, but Ghost's foresight and preparation allowed them to remain one step ahead. Finally, they reached the heart of the field's training grounds. Ghost paused, surveying the open area ahead. It was risky, exposed, but necessary. "This is where we turn the tables," she said. "They think they've predicted our moves. They think they know the outcome. We'll show them otherwise." Ray's hands shook, sweat dripping into his eyes. He realized the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. This was no longer about evasion. It was about confrontation, about using knowledge, strategy, and skill to survive against an enemy trained to kill. And he had only a fraction of the understanding required. Ghost moved forward first, silent, calculating, her every step measured. Ray followed, staying low, breathing shallow, trusting instinct over understanding. Atlas Strike's operatives converged, moving with precision and discipline. But Ghost had created opportunities in the shadows, exploiting blind spots, forcing them into positions where they could be neutralized without gunfire or exposure. Each movement was a testament to her experience, her legendary skill, and the terrifying efficiency that had earned her the name Ghost. The confrontation escalated quickly. Ray watched in awe and fear as Ghost dismantled Atlas Strike's team with controlled force, using misdirection, terrain, and speed to maintain the advantage. The operatives were formidable, but they were human, and Ghost was something beyond that, an apex predator operating at the edge of possibility. Ray realized that his survival was not a gift but a privilege, a direct result of her intervention and mastery. When the last operative was incapacitated or fleeing, Ghost allowed herself a brief pause. Ray, breathing heavily, leaned against a wall, finally understanding the depth of the world he had stumbled into. We did it," he whispered, almost in disbelief. Ghost didn't answer immediately. Her eyes scanned the perimeter, ensuring no further threat. Then she finally spoke, calm, unflinching. "This isn't over. They'll regroup. They'll try again, but we've bought time, and for now, that's enough." Ray nodded, still trembling. I don't even know how to thank you," he said. Ghost gave him a fleeting look, a shadow of humanity crossing her features. "Survival is thanks enough," she said. "Learn from this, understand the world you've entered, and remember, luck is not what keeps you alive. Skill, awareness, and trust are." As the sun finally broke through the fog, illuminating the skeletal remains of fields, Ray realized that he had witnessed a legend in motion and survived. Hale, the Ghost, remained untouchable, unstoppable, and utterly human beneath the myth. But he also understood the terrifying truth. The night was far from over. Atlas Strike would return, and when they did, the stakes would be higher than ever. Ray had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. He was no longer a petty criminal on familiar streets. He was a participant in a dangerous, clandestine world where survival depended on precision, trust, and the skill of someone who existed in myth as much as in reality. And Ghost, as always, moved silently, watching, calculating, unstoppable, the living embodiment of legend. The city had gone silent, but Ghost Hale knew better. Silence was never empty, it was a mask, a lull before the storm. She moved with the same lethal precision as always, leading Ray through a maze of backstreets and forgotten tunnels. Fields had slowed Atlas' strike, but it had not eliminated the threat. The paramilitary organization was calculating, patient, relentless, and most importantly, dangerous. Ghost understood that tonight would be more than survival, it would be revelation. Ray struggled to keep pace, his body screaming from exhaustion, his mind grappling with the impossible reality of the world he had been thrust into. "How are they still after us?" he asked, breathless. Ghost didn't answer immediately. Her gaze was fixed on the shadows ahead, reading movements and signals invisible to him. "Atlas Strike doesn't make mistakes," she said finally. "They regroup, they observe, and they always know more than you think. Every move we make, every misstep, it's cataloged." Ray shivered. He had thought their encounter at Fields had shifted the balance, that perhaps their pursuers had been neutralized or at least delayed. He hadn't understood that Atlas Strike was not a single team, but a network of highly trained operatives and informants, a machine designed to locate and eliminate targets with surgical precision. And Ghost was the one variable they had not been able to control, the ghost in their system, untouchable, unpredictable. They reached a nestled between crumbling warehouses, a place Ghost had used before during her disappearances. It was secured with reinforced locks, sensors, and improvised traps. Her years of preparation turned into a fortress of survival. As she moved through the interior, Ray realized that every inch of this space reflected her experience and foresight. Nothing had been left to chance, no corner unprotected, no entry point unsecured. "Sit," she instructed, motioning to a worn chair. Ray obeyed, his muscles trembling. Ghost pulled a map from a hidden compartment and spread it across the table, pointing to key locations. "Atlas Strike has leadership," she explained, tracing routes with a gloved finger. "They're not just a network of soldiers, they're strategists, planners, and enforcers. If we want to end this, we need to find the source, the head of the snake." Ray leaned forward, trying to comprehend the scope of what she was saying. "You mean take them out?" he asked cautiously. Ghost didn't flinch. "We don't have a choice," she said. "They'll keep hunting, keep targeting innocents. We either act now or we continue running, and I don't run from things I can confront." Ray swallowed hard. He had always lived by luck and instinct. Now survival depended on strategy, skill, and trust. Ghost turned to him, her gaze sharp. "You're going to help. You may not have training, but you have something just as important: connection. Michael's past saved you tonight, and it will save us again. He knows people, resources, and strategies we can leverage, but we have to be precise. One mistake and it's over." The plan took shape quickly. Ghost had scouted Atlas Strike's known locations, identified weak points, and anticipated their patterns. Ray's role would be supporting, observing, and occasionally misdirecting, tasks that seemed simple but required absolute focus and discipline. Ghost's teachings from earlier encounters crystallized into purpose. Ray began to understand that survival was more than reaction. It was calculation, foresight, and decisive action. As night fell once more, Ghost and Ray moved. Every step was deliberate, every shadow a potential threat. They approached the outskirts of Atlas Strike's operational hub, a fortified compound that seemed impenetrable. Ghost scanned the perimeter, identifying cameras, patrols, and potential entry points. "We go in silently," she instructed. "No alarms, no mistakes. We get the information, neutralize the leadership, and leave. Fast." Ray's heart raced. "And if we're seen?" he asked. Ghost's expression hardened. "Then we adapt, we survive, we don't hesitate." Inside the compound, the air was tense, thick with anticipation. Ghost led Ray through hidden corridors, bypassing guards with subtle misdirection and silent precision. Ray could barely follow, his senses overwhelmed by adrenaline, fear, and awe. Every movement demonstrated Ghost's legendary skill, every action a lesson in lethal efficiency. He realized that he was witnessing the culmination of years of training, discipline, and instinct, a force the world had never fully comprehended. They reached the heart of the compound, a dimly lit office where Atlas Strike's leadership was gathered. Ghost crouched behind a pillar, observing the individuals who had orchestrated the relentless pursuit. They were experienced, composed, dangerous, But Ghost had the advantage of surprise, of anticipation, of absolute knowledge of their environment. Ray's role became clear: distract, observe, and assist. Ghost moved with surgical precision, neutralizing security measures, bypassing alarms, and ensuring that every action remained invisible to the enemy. She allowed Ray to witness her work, teaching him the weight of decision-making and the precision required to survive against forces far beyond ordinary comprehension. As the operation progressed, Ghost uncovered the truth behind Atlas Strike's obsession with her. Their interest wasn't merely in eliminating a rogue operative. They sought to exploit her skills, her intelligence, and her connections. Ghost had once been a tool, and now she was their greatest threat. The leaders had underestimated her survival instincts, her strategic genius, and her capacity to manipulate the battlefield. And now, with Ray at her side, they were beginning to pay the price for that miscalculation. The confrontation escalated. Ghost moved through the office with lethal grace, incapacitating guards silently, collecting intelligence, and ensuring that the leaders were cornered. Ray, though inexperienced, followed her guidance meticulously, assisting in ways he never imagined he could. Every instinct, every lesson, every calculated risk mattered. Failure was not an option. Finally, the leaders were isolated, their plans laid bare. Ghost confronted them directly, her presence commanding, terrifying, undeniable. "You've hunted me for too long," she said, her voice cold and unyielding. "Your obsession ends tonight." She presented evidence of their operations, their manipulations, and their crimes, a demonstration of power, skill, and inevitability. The leaders understood that they were defeated, not by brute force alone, but by strategy, precision, and the relentless will of a woman who had mastered survival. Ghost's presence was absolute, undeniable, a force that transcended myth. Ray watched in awe as the culmination of her legend unfolded before him, calm, decisive, unstoppable. As they exited the compound, Ghost's voice broke the silence. "We've won tonight, but the world never stops. Atlas Strike will adapt, evolve, and return, but we've bought time, and that is enough." Ray nodded, understanding finally the weight of what they had accomplished. They had confronted impossible odds, exposed a hidden enemy, and survived where most would have failed. In the quiet aftermath, Ray felt a mixture of relief, fear, and admiration. He had walked through a world beyond his comprehension, witnessed the lethal skill of a living legend, and survived. Ghost Hale had not only saved his life but had taught him the harshest lesson of all. Survival was never about luck. It was about precision, trust, and the courage to confront the impossible. As dawn broke over Norfolk, Ghost disappeared into the shadows once more, leaving Ray to process the night's events. He had been changed forever, thrust into a world of myth and danger, and yet he had survived. And in that survival lay the understanding that Hale was more than a soldier, more than a legend. She was the Ghost, untouchable, unstoppable, and unrelenting. Ray knew one undeniable truth: his life, and everyone he cared about, would never be the same again. Ghost had shown him the world in its most dangerous form, and he would never forget it. The night had revealed enemies, allies, and the impossible power of a woman who existed as both myth and reality. And though the immediate danger had passed, the echoes of Atlas Strike would continue, reminding him that in Ghost's world, survival was earned, never given. Dawn broke over Norfolk like a promise that the night's chaos had finally ended. The fog clung stubbornly to the docks and warehouses, but the city seemed to exhale, its streets quiet for the first time in hours. Ghost Hale moved silently through the empty alleys, her eyes scanning the horizon, ears tuned to the faintest anomalies. The confrontation at Atlas Strike's compound had ended in victory, but Ghost knew better than to believe the threat was gone. Atlas Strike was relentless, patient, and adaptive. Survival meant never letting down her guard, even for a moment. Ray struggled to keep pace, his legs trembling from exhaustion, his mind a whirlwind of adrenaline and disbelief. He had survived impossible odds, witnessed feats that comprehension, and now stood in the aftermath of a world he had never imagined existed. Ghost glanced at him briefly, nodding the mixture of awe, fear, and determination in his eyes. "You did well," she said, almost softly, her words a rare acknowledgement of his efforts. Ray could only nod, still processing everything. The streets were deceptively calm, yet every instinct Ghost had honed over years of covert operations screamed caution. She led Ray to a place she had prepared for emergencies and temporary retreats. Inside, she secured the perimeter, checked the entrances, and set improvised sensors, small devices that would alert them to any intrusion. "We have a few hours," she said. "Not for rest, but to plan. Atlas Strike will recover, and when they do, they'll retaliate." Ray sank into a chair, his body aching, his mind racing. "I can't believe this, all of it," he muttered. You're incredible. I mean, I knew you were, but seeing it's unreal." Ghost didn't respond immediately. Her eyes scanned the perimeter once more before she finally spoke. "Incredible doesn't survive. Discipline does. Skill does. Preparation does. You survived tonight because you followed instructions, adapted, and didn't panic. That's how the living outlast the hunted." The plan for the next move was deliberate. Ghost had obtained critical intelligence from Atlas Strike's headquarters, the identities of their leaders, operational nodes, and contingency strategies. She and Ray would not merely evade the organization. They would dismantle it, strike at its core, and neutralize the threat. Ghost's approach was methodical: precision strikes, misdirection, and leveraging Ray's connection to Michael to gather external support. Every detail mattered. Mistakes could mean death. Hours passed as Ghost briefed Ray, teaching him what he would need to survive the final phase. He learned to anticipate, observe, and respond, not with instinct alone, but with calculation. Ghost's instructions were precise, her demeanor unwavering, and her presence commanding. Ray began to understand what survival in her world truly required: focus, trust, and an unshakable commitment to the mission. Night fell again, casting Norfolk in shadows. Ghost and Ray moved toward the location of Atlas Strike's remaining leadership, a fortified mansion on the outskirts of the city. The perimeter was guarded, but Ghost's reconnaissance and planning allowed them to approach unseen. She guided Ray silently, signaling when to move, when to pause, and when to act. His trust in her had, tempered by fear and awe. The operation began. Ghost neutralized the outer guards with calculated precision, silently taking each threat out before alarms could be raised. Ray assisted where he could, misdirecting remaining operatives, setting distractions, and ensuring their path remained clear. The mansion became a stage for Ghost's mastery, each movement deliberate, each action lethal yet controlled. Ray realized he was participating in a world that operated under rules entirely different from his own. Inside, the confrontation with Atlas Strike's leaders was inevitable. Ghost cornered them in a study lined with books and maps detailing their operations. The men realized too late that they had underestimated her. Her presence was absolute, calm, commanding, and terrifying. Ray watched as she dismantled their strategies with facts, evidence, and authority, leaving them exposed and powerless. Ghost's reputation was no myth. It was lived reality, and these men were experiencing the consequences firsthand. "You hunted me for too long," Ghost said, her voice low and lethal. "Your obsession ends tonight." She revealed evidence of their operations, connections to illegal activities, and manipulations across multiple continents. The leaders attempted to negotiate, to bribe, to threaten, but Ghost was unyielding. Every word, every gesture, every decision reinforced her dominance. Survival was not negotiation. Survival was action, precision, and unflinching resolve. Ray assisted in the extraction of critical evidence, following Ghost's instructions to the letter. He had grown beyond his initial fear, adapting under extreme pressure and gaining confidence from her guidance. He realized that he had changed irrevocably, no longer the petty criminal he had once been, but a participant in a high-stakes world where trust, skill, and awareness determined life or death. With the leadership neutralized and evidence secured, Ghost led Ray back into the shadows. The mission was a success, but she remained vigilant. "This isn't the end," she said. "Atlas Strike will adapt, others will follow. The world is full of hunters and ghosts, but tonight we survive." Ray nodded, understanding fully that survival had been earned, not granted. As they disappeared into the pre-dawn streets, Ghost reflected briefly on her path. Her life had been defined by discipline, secrecy, and sacrifice. The missions she had undertaken, the lives she had saved, and the enemies she had outmaneuvered, all of it had led to this moment. Ray's presence had been a complication, a risk, but also a reminder of her humanity, her ability to protect, guide, and inspire even in the darkest moments. Ray, exhausted and awed, looked at Ghost and finally understood the weight of legend. I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. Ghost's eyes softened for a fleeting moment. "Survive," she said. "Remember what you've learned, use it, and respect the shadows. That's the only thanks I need." The city around them awakened, oblivious to the violence, strategy, and lethal skill that had unfolded in its shadows. Ghost moved silently through the streets, leaving no trace behind, as she had done countless times before. Ray followed, forever changed, carrying with him the knowledge of what it meant to survive in a world few could comprehend. By the time the sun rose fully over Norfolk, the fog had lifted and the streets were calm. Ghost paused briefly on a rooftop, looking over the city she had protected and navigated countless times. She allowed herself a rare moment of reflection, not victory, not triumph, but acknowledgement of another mission survived. Ray had witnessed her legend and against all odds lived to tell it. "Remember," she said finally, speaking more to herself than to Ray, "the shadows are always watching, and legends endure." Ray watched as she disappeared into the cityscape, her silhouette swallowed by light and distance. He understood that he had been part of something extraordinary, something that transcended ordinary life. Ghost was not merely a soldier or operative. She was the living embodiment of skill, precision, and survival. And though the danger of Atlas strike lingered, he knew that she would remain untouchable, unstoppable, and eternal. Ray had survived the impossible. Ghost Hale had endured yet again, and the legend continued as it always had, silent, invisible, and unstoppable. In the world of shadows, she was untouchable. In the lives she touched, she was unforgettable. And in the stories whispered across the covert world, Ghost remained, as always, a name to fear, admire, and remember.